New York City, 2021. For years, children vanished from the city's outer boroughs, their cases dismissed as cold. While authorities blamed urban legends and train noise, a veteran subway worker heard something else in the tunnels, a whisper of the truth. His lonely, obsessive search would lead him down a hidden path, exposing an invisible underground highway and a conspiracy of neglect that had allowed a nightmare to fester in the city's heart. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Darnell Jacobs understood the city in a way few ever could. He knew its bones. For more than 20 years, his world had been the deep, dark, and rumbling labyrinth beneath the streets of New York, the vast and intricate network of tunnels that was the city's true circulatory system. As a maintenance worker for the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, he was a master of this forgotten world, a place of iron, steel, and a darkness so profound it felt like a physical weight. At 44, Darnell was a man carved from the same stubborn, resilient material as the city itself. He was quiet, observant, and known by his colleagues for a kind of dogged, almost obsessive persistence. When a signal needed tracing or a pipe needed finding in a section of tunnel that hadn't been mapped since the 1930s, Darnell was the man they called. He didn't just see a maze of tracks and wires. He saw a living, breathing organism, a creature with its own secret anatomy, its own hidden language. This intimate knowledge of the city's underbelly was twinned with a deep, personal sense of duty. He was a widower, having lost his wife to a sudden illness years ago, an event that had reshaped his life and left him the sole guardian of their daughter, Chloe. His love for Chloe was a quiet, fierce, and all-consuming thing, a protective instinct that extended beyond the walls of their small Bronx apartment and into the dark, echoing tunnels where he worked. He saw the subway not just as a workplace, but as a part of his territory, a place he had a responsibility to keep safe. It was this sense of duty that made him a bit of a nuisance to his superiors. He was a reporter of things. He would file reports about strange noises, about sections of wall that seemed to have been recently patched, about drafts of air coming from places where there should have been only solid rock. Most of his reports were dismissed, filed away as the overactive imagination of a man who spent too much time in the dark. But Darnell was not a man who was easily deterred. He believed in what he saw and what he heard. His life was a simple, structured routine. He would work his shift, come home to his daughter, help her with her homework, and then, in the quiet hours of the night, he would sometimes sit with his old, worn MTA blueprints spread out on the kitchen table, a silent, lonely scholar of the city's secret, subterranean world. He was a man who listened to the city's heart, never knowing that he was about to hear it break. 2 years before Darnell's obsession would take root, Maria Torres's world had ended. It had ended on a bright, sunny Tuesday afternoon when her 12-year-old son, Leo, had walked the 3 familiar blocks from his school to their Bronx apartment and had never arrived. One moment, he was a boy full of life, with a goofy, infectious laugh and a passion for comic books. The next, he was a ghost, a smiling, hopeful face on a missing persons flyer. The initial police investigation had been a brutal lesson in bureaucratic indifference. They had seen not a terrified, grieving mother, but a stereotype. A single, Latina mother from a tough neighborhood. They had seen her son not as a beloved child, but as a statistic. The word runaway had been floated on the first day, a convenient catch-all explanation that required little in the way of actual investigation. Kids his age, from this neighborhood, they get into trouble, Maria, the detective had told her, his voice a tired, condescending drone. He's probably just laying low with some friends. He'll turn up when he's ready. But Maria knew her son. Leo was not a runaway. He was a good kid, a little shy, a homebody who would rather spend his Saturday drawing superheroes than hanging out on the street. She had fought, she had pleaded, she had screamed, but she was a lone, powerless voice against a wall of systemic, soul-crushing apathy. Her son's case had quickly gone cold, his file tossed onto a mountain of other forgotten stories. Another brown-skinned boy from the Bronx who the city had decided was not worth the trouble of finding. Her life had become a walking vigil. She still worked her 2 jobs, cleaning offices late into the night, but every spare moment, every ounce of her energy, was dedicated to the search. She became a familiar, heartbreaking figure in her community. A woman armed with a stapler and a stack of faded flyers, her face a mask of a grief so profound it seemed to have been permanently etched into her features. She was a mother who had been abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect her. She had no allies, no resources, no hope. But she had a mother's faith, a stubborn, and in the eyes of the world, a delusional belief that her son was still out there, somewhere, waiting for her. She had no way of knowing that her first and only true ally was a man she had never met, a man who worked in the darkness beneath her feet, a man who was just beginning to hear the first, faint, and terrifying whispers of the truth. The first time Darnell heard it, he dismissed it as a trick of the tunnels. The New York City subway system was a symphony of strange, unaccountable noises. The shriek of the train wheels, the groan of stressed metal, the hiss of the pneumatic brakes, it was a language he had long ago learned to understand. But this sound was different. He was in a deep, little-used maintenance tunnel that ran parallel to the main line, checking a section of old, decaying signal cable. It was late, after midnight, the time when the train traffic was at its lightest. In a long, quiet interval between the thunderous roar of the express trains, he heard it, a faint, high-pitched sound, a sound that was almost human, a cry. It was there for only a second, a brief, piercing note in the deep, resonant silence of the tunnel, and then it was gone, swallowed by the familiar, ambient hum of the city's sleeping heart. He stopped what he was doing and just stood there, his headlamp cutting a bright, lonely circle in the absolute darkness, his ears straining. But there was only silence. He told himself it was the pipes. The old, high-pressure water mains that ran through the tunnels would often make strange, high-pitched, sighing noises as the pressure shifted. It was a common and well-documented phenomenon. It was the logical explanation, but the sound had felt different. It had held a note of a pain, of a terror, that was not mechanical. He did his duty. He went back to the station at the end of his shift, and he filed a report. He wrote it out in his neat, careful block letters, describing the time, the location, and the nature of the sound. He handed it to his supervisor, a man named Frank Shaw. Shaw was a man who had been with the MTA for 30 years. A man whose entire career had been built on the principle of not making waves. He glanced at Darnell's report, a look of weary, paternalistic amusement on his face. "Acoustic bleed, Jacobs," he said, the words a tired, familiar refrain. "You know how it is down there. Sound bounces around." It was probably a ventilation shaft carrying a sound from the street. Or it was the pipes. "It's always the pipes." Darnell stood his ground. "It didn't sound like pipes, Frank. It sounded like a kid." Shaw sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of breath. "Darnell, we get these reports all the time. People hear ghosts in the tunnels. You've been working this job long enough to know better. Just forget about it. It was nothing, and that was it." The report was filed away, a small, insignificant piece of paper that would be buried under a mountain of other, more important, paperwork. The first echo of a monstrous, hidden truth had been heard, and it had been immediately and officially dismissed as nothing more than the groan of an old, tired pipe. The dismissal Darnell faced was not just the weary cynicism of a single supervisor. It was a symptom of a larger, systemic indifference, a wall of excuses that had been built, brick by brick, over decades of neglect. The rumors of strange things happening in the city's vast, subterranean world were as old as the subway system itself. They were a part of the city's folklore, a collection of urban legends about mole people, of ghosts of workers lost during the tunnel's construction, of secret, forgotten stations. These stories were a convenient, all-purpose explanation for anything that was out of the ordinary, and the authorities, both the MTA and the NYPD, had become masters at using them as a shield against any real investigation. When a report of a strange noise or a shadowy figure came in, the official response was a well-rehearsed, bureaucratic shuffle. The NYPD would claim it was a transit authority issue, a matter of internal security for the MTA to handle. The MTA, in turn, would claim it was a police matter, that they were responsible for the trains, not for policing the vast, unmappable wilderness of the tunnels themselves. The result was a perfect, self-perpetuating cycle of inaction, a jurisdictional black hole into which any complaint or concern would simply disappear. The city's large and largely invisible unhoused population provided another, convenient explanation. Any strange sightings, any reports of voices or movement in the tunnels were almost always attributed to the homeless, who were known to seek shelter in the relative warmth of the underground. It was a simple, plausible, and deeply cynical explanation that allowed the authorities to dismiss any report without having to actually investigate it. Then there was the budget. The MTA was a perpetually underfunded and crumbling institution. The idea of launching a full-scale, systematic inspection of the hundreds of miles of abandoned tunnels and sealed-off stations was, in the eyes of the city's bean counters, a laughable and fiscally irresponsible fantasy. There was simply no money, no manpower, no political will to take on such a monumental task. The local media, for their part, treated the stories as a kind of lurid, but ultimately harmless, local color. They would run the occasional, sensationalized piece about the ghosts of the subway, but they never treated it as a serious, investigative story. It was an urban legend, a fun, spooky tale to tell on a slow news day. And finally, there was the memory of the past. Years earlier, a group of teenagers had been caught after they had spent a week using the tunnel's natural acoustics to fake the sounds of screams, a prank that had caused a brief and ultimately embarrassing public panic. The memory of that false alarm had a long, chilling effect on any official response to new reports. No one wanted to be the one to trigger another citywide panic over what would likely turn out to be another hoax. This wall of excuses was a fortress of institutional denial. It was a system that was perfectly designed to ignore the very kind of quiet, persistent, and terrifying truth that Darnell Jacobs had just begun to uncover. The whispers in the dark were real. But the system had already decided, long ago, that it was not going to listen. While the city's official guardians slept, a different, and far more sinister, organization was wide awake and hard at work. The network was a ghost, a perfectly designed and terrifyingly efficient criminal enterprise that had turned the city's own, neglected underworld into its personal, invisible highway. They were not a gang. They were not a mob. They were a corporation, a logistical machine that operated with the cold, dispassionate efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. Their business was human trafficking. Their product was children. Their genius was in their choice of venue. They understood that the most dangerous part of their operation was the transportation of their victims. The city above ground was a place of surveillance, of witnesses, of 1,000 unpredictable variables. The city below, however, was a place of shadows, of silence, of a vast, unmappable, and completely unpoliced wilderness. They had systematically and patiently colonized the forgotten corners of the subway system. They had used old, pre-war blueprints to identify the hundreds of miles of abandoned service tunnels, of sealed-off ghost stations, of the secret connecting corridors that had been built as emergency routes during the Cold War. They had created their own, private, and completely off-the-books subway map. Their operation was a masterpiece of compartmentalization. The abductions themselves were carried out by low-level, local operatives who knew nothing of the larger network. Their job was to acquire the product. They targeted the city's most vulnerable children, the ones whose disappearance was least likely to trigger a massive, sustained, and high-profile police response. Once a child was taken, they would be brought to a designated discreet entry point into the tunnel system, a maintenance hatch in a deserted alleyway, a ventilation shaft in an abandoned building, and there, they would be handed off to the network's transporters. The children would then be moved, often sedated, through the dark, silent, and terrifying labyrinth of the tunnels. They were human cargo, moved with the same impersonal efficiency as a shipment of illegal goods. The tunnels were a perfect, invisible pipeline, a way of moving their victims across the city and even out to other connected locations in the suburbs, without ever having to surface, without ever having to risk being seen. The network's evil was not chaotic or passionate. It was a cold, pragmatic, and terrifyingly successful business model. It was a monster that had made its lair in the very bones of the city, a parasite that was feeding on the city's most vulnerable, and on its own, willful blindness. It was an invisible highway, a secret, subterranean river of sorrow, and its existence was a truth that was so monstrous, so unbelievable, that the city above had simply and collectively decided it could not possibly be real. The meeting was a collision of two, very different and very desperate, worlds. Maria Torres had spent 2 years fighting a lonely and losing battle against a system that refused to listen. She had exhausted every official channel. She had pleaded with detectives. She had begged local politicians. She had tried, and failed, to get the attention of the city's media. She was a woman on the verge of surrendering to a despair that was as vast and as empty as the city itself. And then she had heard a whisper, a rumor, pass through the informal grapevine network of her community, of a subway worker, a man who believed the old, crazy stories about strange things happening in the tunnels, a man who had been filing his own, consistently ignored, reports, a man who, like her, was a voice that no one was listening to. She found Darnell Jacobs not through any official channel, but through a cousin who worked for the MTA. She waited for him outside his station at the end of his shift, a small, determined figure in the cold November wind, a faded, laminated picture of her son Leo clutched in her hand. Their first conversation took place on a windswept, elevated subway platform, the roar of the passing trains a constant, percussive interruption. Maria, her voice a low, intense, and incredibly controlled instrument of her grief, told him her story. She told him about Leo, about his disappearance, about the wall of official indifference she had been beating her head against for 2 long and agonizing years. Darnell listened, his own face a mask of weary, stoic empathy. He had heard the stories, he had seen the flyers. He was a man who understood the geography of a parent's grief. "They say there are things happening down there," Maria said, her eyes, dark and full of a desperate, flickering hope, locking onto his. "They say you've heard them. Cries, voices. Is it true?" Darnell hesitated. To admit what he had heard was to invite the same dismissive pity that he knew she had already endured. But there was something in her eyes, a fierce, unwavering, and utterly, heartbreakingly sane conviction that cut through his own protective shield of silence. "I've heard things," he admitted, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The MTA says it's the pipes. The cops say it's the homeless. No one wants to look. But you believe it's something else," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of a shared and deeply forbidden truth. In that moment, a fragile and incredibly powerful alliance was formed. They were 2 forgotten people, a grieving mother and a stubborn subway worker. 2 lone voices that the city had dismissed as background noise. But together, they were a chorus. Maria's fierce, desperate hope was the spark that ignited Darnell's own, smoldering sense of duty into a raging, all-consuming fire. He was no longer just a worker who filed reports. He was an investigator, and she was no longer just a grieving mother. She was his partner, his advocate, his conscience. They were an unlikely and utterly invisible team, and they were about to declare a quiet, secret, and very personal war on the ghost that was haunting the city from below. The alliance with Maria Torres transformed Darnell Jacobs. His quiet, stubborn sense of duty, which had been a passive, reactive thing, now hardened into an active and very dangerous mission. He was no longer just a maintenance worker who noticed things. He was a hunter, and the vast, dark, and unmappable wilderness of the subway system was his new and very personal hunting ground. He began to use his own time, the long, lonely hours of his evenings and weekends, to conduct his own secret investigation. He had a key that most New Yorkers did not, his MTA ID, a small plastic card that could open the doors to the city's hidden subterranean world. His first step was to gather the maps. He spent hours in the MTA's dusty, forgotten archives, a place where no one had looked for decades. He found the old, pre-war blueprints, the ones that showed the subway system not as the clean, simplified, and color-coded map that the public saw, but as the chaotic, sprawling, and beautifully complex organism that it truly was. He found the maps that showed the abandoned stations, the sealed-off service tunnels, the secret, connecting corridors that had been written off the official record. He began to cross-reference these old, forgotten maps with a new and far more tragic one. He had Maria get him the addresses, the last known locations, of every missing child case from the past 5 years that had been dismissed as a runaway. And he began to plot them. A series of small red pins on his own private map of the city. A pattern, a dark and terrifyingly logical one, began to emerge. The clusters of disappearances on the surface correlated with a chilling, undeniable precision to the locations of the abandoned, forgotten, and officially non-existent infrastructure below. His daughter, Chloe, a quiet, observant 16-year-old who had inherited her father's thoughtful nature, watched his growing obsession with a mixture of a deep and very real fear for his safety and a profound and very fierce pride in his unwavering sense of right and wrong. She would watch him at the kitchen table late at night, his large, calloused hands carefully tracing the faint, blue lines of an old, crumbling blueprint, his face a mask of an intense and almost sacred concentration. She knew he was hunting for something. She didn't know what it was, but she knew that it was important, and she knew that he was the only one in the world who was doing it. "Be careful, Dad," she would whisper to him, her own voice a quiet and very loving echo of his own. "Always," he would reply, his eyes never leaving the map. He was a man who was living a double life. By day, he was Darnell Jacobs, the reliable, if slightly eccentric, MTA maintenance worker. But by night, he was a different man. He was an explorer, a detective, a cartographer of a hidden, monstrous truth. He was a lonely and very determined warrior, descending, night after night, into the darkness, armed with nothing but a flashlight, an old map, and the quiet, unwavering belief that he was on the right path. While Darnell was waging his secret, subterranean war, Maria Torres was fighting her own, very public battle in the world of light. She understood that Darnell's work, as vital as it was, would mean nothing if it remained in the shadows. They needed to bring their story into the light, to force the city to see what it had so willfully and so consistently ignored. She became the public face of their lonely two-person movement. Her grief, which had once been a private, all-consuming thing, was now her greatest weapon. She channeled her pain into a relentless and incredibly powerful campaign of public advocacy. She organized vigils. They were not the large, media-friendly events that the city was used to. They were small, sad, and deeply, profoundly human gatherings. She would stand at the entrance to a subway station in the Bronx or in Brooklyn, in one of the neighborhoods that had been hit the hardest by the string of disappearances, and she would hold up the smiling, hopeful face of her son, Leo. She would be joined by a small handful of other parents, other families of the forgotten, their own faces a silent, heartbreaking testament to the city's indifference. They would light candles, they would say a prayer, and they would stand in a silent, defiant circle of light against the city's vast, overwhelming darkness. The media rarely came. The police would watch them from a distance, their presence a mixture of professional duty and a quiet, weary annoyance. But Maria did not care. She was not performing for them. She was performing for her son. She was sending a message into the universe, a quiet, unwavering promise that he was not forgotten, that she would never stop fighting for him. She became a student of the system that had so profoundly failed her. She spent her days off in the law library, reading about victims' rights, about police accountability, about the legal responsibilities of the MTA. She wrote letters, she made phone calls. She became a constant, nagging, and deeply inconvenient presence in the offices of city council members, of police captains, of MTA bureaucrats. She was a mother who had been transformed into a warrior. She was no longer just a grieving parent. She was an advocate, an investigator, a relentless and incredibly powerful voice for the voiceless. Her partnership with Darnell was a perfect, symbiotic one. He was the quiet, methodical, and subterranean half of their operation. She was the loud, passionate, and public one. He was gathering the evidence, the cold, hard, and undeniable facts from the darkness below. She was building the narrative, the powerful, emotional, and deeply human story in the light above. They were a team, a perfect and perfectly balanced instrument of a long overdue justice, and together they were slowly but surely building a case that the city would, eventually, be unable to ignore. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit worlds of the NYPD's headquarters at One Police Plaza and the MTA's administrative offices in Lower Manhattan, the names of Darnell Jacobs and Maria Torres were a minor and deeply annoying irritant. They were a background noise, a low-grade, persistent hum of a problem that was easier to ignore than to address. For Captain O'Malley of the NYPD, the issue was a simple and a frustrating one of jurisdiction and statistics. The missing children cases from the outer boroughs were, in his data-driven analysis, a statistical certainty. They were runaways. They were the sad but predictable result of poverty, of broken homes, of 1,000 complex and ultimately unsolvable social problems. They were not, in his professional assessment, the work of a single, unifying and criminal conspiracy. Maria Torres's constant, emotional pleas were, to him, the understandable but ultimately unhelpful cries of a grieving mother who could not accept the truth. Darnell Jacobs was an even bigger problem. He was a crank, an MTA worker who was overstepping his bounds, a man who was fueling a dangerous and baseless conspiracy theory. O'Malley's response was a classic, bureaucratic defense. He would punt. When pressed, he would claim that the security of the subway tunnels was the MTA's responsibility. He would cite the department's limited resources, the crushing caseload of more immediate, more violent, and more solvable crimes. His job was to manage the city's perception of crime, and a deep, complex, and potentially explosive investigation into a series of forgotten, cold cases was a political and professional nightmare he had no intention of unleashing. For Frank Shaw, Darnell's supervisor at the MTA, the issue was even simpler. It was a matter of liability. The subway system was a crumbling, pre-war relic, a labyrinth of decaying infrastructure and 1,000 potential lawsuits. The last thing he needed was one of his own employees, a known, stubborn, eccentric, claiming that the tunnels were being used by a secret, child-abducting network. His response to Darnell's reports had been to shut them down, to dismiss them, to bury them under a mountain of paperwork. He had given Darnell a direct and very clear order. Stick to your job, fix the cables, and stop playing detective. He saw Darnell not as a whistleblower, but as a problem employee, a man who was a walking, talking, and potentially very expensive lawsuit waiting to happen. And so, the system slept. While O'Malley was dealing with budget cuts and union negotiations, and while Shaw was dealing with track fires and signal malfunctions, the real and very monstrous problem was being allowed to fester, to grow, in the darkness beneath their feet. They were two powerful men, the gatekeepers of the city's safety and its infrastructure, and they had both, for their own separate and deeply institutionally flawed reasons, made the same catastrophic decision. They had decided to do nothing. They had decided to let the ghosts of the subway sleep, a decision that was about to be proven, in the most spectacular and most horrifying way, to be a tragic and very public mistake. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a slow, methodical process of investigation. It was a sudden, violent, and undeniable scream in the dark. Darnell was on a late-night shift, working with his crew in a section of tunnel near an old, long-abandoned, and officially sealed-off station, a relic from the early 20th century. The work was routine, replacing a section of corroded third rail. It was a noisy, physically demanding job, a symphony of grinding tools and the shouted commands of the crew foreman. But in a brief, quiet moment, when the grinders had stopped and the crew was taking a water break, Darnell heard it again. This was not the faint, ambiguous, and easily dismissible sound he had heard years ago. This was a sound that was close, that was clear, and that was absolutely, undeniably human. It was the sound of a child's voice, a single, sharp, and quickly muffled cry of pure, unadulterated terror. It had come from the direction of the abandoned station, a cold, electric shock, a feeling of pure and terrifying vindication shot through Darnell. He was not crazy. He was not imagining things. It was real. The other members of his crew had heard it too. They stood frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion and a dawning, superstitious fear. What the hell was that? One of the younger workers whispered, his eyes wide. It's the pipes. The foreman, a man who had learned the MTA's official language of denial, said quickly, a little too quickly. It's just the pipes. Now get back to work. But Darnell could not get back to work. He could not unhear what he had just heard. He had a witness. A crew of them. The official, plausible deniability of the MTA had just been shattered. He went to his supervisor, Frank Shaw, the next morning. But this time, he was not a lone, eccentric voice. He was a man with a story that could be corroborated by half a dozen other MTA employees. Shaw's reaction was not one of concern, but of a cold, managerial fury. He saw not a credible report, but a potential, and very public, crisis. He saw a story that could, if it got out, bring a world of unwanted and very expensive scrutiny down on his department. He gave Darnell another, and very final, order. "You will drop this, Jacobs," he said, his voice a low, menacing hiss. "You will tell your crew that they were mistaken, that they were tired, that it was the pipes. If I hear one more word about this, from you or from any of them, you will be on permanent, unpaid, administrative leave. Do you understand me?" It was a threat, a bribe, and a declaration of a corporate, institutional war. Darnell understood perfectly. He had the truth, a truth that could be verified by witnesses, and the system was now actively and aggressively trying to silence it. He knew, in that moment, that he could no longer fight this war from the inside. He had to go outside. He had to go rogue. The cry in the dark had not just been a clue. It had been a call to action, a call that he was now, finally, and very dangerously, ready to answer. The threat from his supervisor was the final, liberating push that Darnell needed. He was no longer bound by the rules, by the procedures, by the bureaucratic chain of command. He was a man on his own, a free agent, and his investigation was about to enter a new and far more dangerous phase. He knew he had to get inside that abandoned station. He waited a week, letting the heat from his confrontation with Shaw die down. And then, on a Saturday night, when he was off the clock, he began his own, personal, and highly illegal, infiltration. He took his own private set of tools, his own powerful battery-operated flashlight, and he went back down into the tunnels. The work was slow, tense, and incredibly dangerous. He had to time his movements to the train schedules, to the long, quiet intervals between the last, late-night trains and the first, pre-dawn ones. He found the main entrance to the abandoned station. It had been sealed, as the official records stated, with a thick, new layer of cinder block. It was impenetrable, but Darnell was not a man who believed in impenetrable barriers. He was a man who knew the secret, hidden anatomy of the subway. He consulted his own, hand-drawn maps, the ones he had made from the old, archived blueprints. And he found another way in. A small, forgotten, and unmapped ventilation shaft that was located in a deserted alleyway, a full half-mile from the station itself. The shaft was a tight, claustrophobic, and filth-encrusted vertical tunnel. But it was a way in. He lowered himself into the darkness, a lone, determined explorer descending into the city's forgotten secret heart. He found himself in a small, side-service tunnel, a place that was not on any of the modern MTA maps. It was a ghost tunnel, a relic from a bygone era, and it led, as his old maps had promised, directly into the abandoned station. The station itself was a magnificent and deeply eerie tomb. The platform was covered in a thick, century-old layer of dust and grime. The old, tile mosaics on the walls were faded, but still beautiful. It was a place of a profound and very heavy silence. He began his search, his flashlight beam cutting a sharp, lonely swathe through the darkness, and then he found it. At the far end of the platform, there was a section of the wall that looked wrong. It was newer, the plaster a different, cleaner color than the rest of the station's ancient, decaying walls. He ran his hand over it. It was hollow. He used a small crowbar from his tool bag and he began to pry at the edge of the false wall. The plaster crumbled, and behind it, he found not a solid, structural wall, but a heavy, steel, and very modern service gate. And the gate was secured with a new, thick, and very recently oiled chain and padlock. This was it. This was the entrance to their world. This was the place that was not supposed to exist. His heart was a wild, frantic drum in his chest, a mixture of a pure, exhilarating triumph and a deep and very cold terror. He had found the unmapped corridor. He had found the door to the nightmare. Darnell was not a man who was easily intimidated. He had spent his life working with heavy, powerful tools. A chain and a padlock were not a barrier. They were a problem to be solved. He returned to the abandoned station the next night, this time with a new and much more powerful tool. A portable, battery-operated angle grinder. The work was loud, violent, and incredibly, nerve-wrackingly tense. The scream of the grinder, the shower of hot orange sparks, the acrid smell of burning metal. It all felt like a massive and very public announcement of his illegal one-man raid. But he knew he had only a few precious, late-night hours in which to work, and he worked with a frantic, desperate speed. The chain, finally, with a loud metallic groan, gave way. He pushed the heavy steel gate open, and he stepped into the unmapped corridor. The air on the other side was different. It was cold, damp, and it smelled of something that he could not, at first, identify. A smell that was a mixture of unwashed bodies, of stale food, and of a deep and very old despair. He moved slowly down the corridor, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And then he found it. The corridor opened up into a small, cave-like room, a space that had clearly been carved out of the natural rock, a place that existed in the void between the subway tunnels and the city's foundations. And in that room, he saw the first, concrete, and absolutely, horrifyingly undeniable proof of the nightmare he had been chasing. The space had been turned into a makeshift and very temporary prison. There were a half-dozen filthy, tattered mattresses on the floor. The ground was littered with empty plastic water bottles, with the discarded wrappers of candy bars and potato chips, and with small, pathetic, and heartbreakingly human debris. He saw a single, small, and very worn pink sneaker. He saw a child's coloring book, its pages filled with the clumsy, colorful, and joyful drawings of a 6- or 7-year-old. He saw a small, dirty, and very well-loved stuffed bear, its button eyes staring up at him from the darkness with a look of a profound and very sad surprise. This was not a place where people were living. This was a place where people were being held. It was a cage, a transfer hub, a human warehouse. He took out his cell phone, his own hands, the hands of a man who was used to the dark and to the horrors of the city, shaking uncontrollably. He turned on the camera, and he began to document. He took pictures of everything: the mattresses, the trash, the single, small, pink sneaker, the coloring book, the bear. He was no longer a man with a crazy, unsubstantiated theory. He was a man with evidence. He had a crime scene, a real, tangible, and utterly, monstrously undeniable crime scene. He had found the first horrifying glimpse into a secret, hidden world of an evil that was so profound, so close, and so incredibly, fantastically real, that he knew, in that moment, that his own life, and the life of the city itself, would never, ever be the same. The photographic evidence Darnell had gathered was a bomb, and Maria Torres was the one who was going to detonate it. She knew, with a fierce and deeply pragmatic clarity, that taking these pictures back to the police, back to the same dismissive system that had ignored them for years, would be a fatal mistake. They needed to go over their heads. They needed to go public. She knew a young, hungry, and very ambitious investigative reporter at a local, online news outlet, a woman who was trying to make a name for herself by breaking the kinds of stories that the city's mainstream corporate media was too lazy or too scared to touch. The meeting took place in a small, anonymous coffee shop. Maria laid Darnell's cell phone on the table between them. She didn't say a word. She just hit play. The reporter watched, her own face a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension as the images flashed across the small screen. The filthy mattresses, the children's debris, the single, heartbreakingly small pink sneaker. "Where did you get this?" the reporter whispered, her voice a raw, shocked thing. "It doesn't matter where I got it," Maria said, her own voice a low, steady, and incredibly powerful instrument of her righteous fury. "What matters is that it's real. And it's happening, right now, under our feet. And the city, the police, the MTA, they are all letting it happen." The story, when it broke the next morning, was an online supernova. The headline was a stark, terrifying, and utterly captivating declaration of war. Ghosts in the subway. Exclusive photos reveal hidden chambers, raise new questions about cities' missing children. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It had Darnell's photos. It had an anonymous, on-the-record interview with him, identified only as a veteran MTA worker. And it had the powerful, heartbreaking, and deeply human story of Maria Torres, the mother who had been fighting, alone, for 2 years to find her son. The story went viral. It was picked up by the national news outlets, by the cable news networks, by the international press. The city of New York, a place that prided itself on its toughness, on its resilience, on its ability to see it all, was suddenly confronted with a story that was so monstrous, so unbelievable, that it was a deep and very public, wound to its own collective psyche. The pressure on the city's officials was immediate, and it was immense. The mayor's office was flooded with calls. Protesters, led by a newly and powerfully emboldened Maria Torres, began to gather outside City Hall, their numbers growing with each passing hour. The urban legend had just been proven to be a fact, and the city was demanding answers. The media firestorm was the final, and most powerful, weapon in Darnell and Maria's long and very lonely war. The wall of official indifference, the one that had seemed so high, so thick, and so impenetrable, had just been blown to smithereens. The story had broken, and a reckoning was coming. The public outcry was a political firestorm that the city's leaders could not ignore. The mayor, his own political future suddenly, and very publicly, on the line, did what all politicians do in a crisis. He formed a task force, but this was not to be a typical, bureaucratic, and ultimately toothless committee. The media pressure was too intense, the public's fury too raw. The investigation was officially and very publicly taken out of the hands of the local, and now deeply embarrassed and discredited NYPD and MTA. A joint federal task force, led by the FBI, was created, and in a move that was a stunning and deeply satisfying reversal of fortune, the two, central and most important, consultants to that task force were the two people who the city had spent years ignoring, Darnell Jacobs and Maria Torres. The first official meeting of the task force was a scene of a tense and deeply ironic theater. It took place in a large, sterile, and windowless conference room in the FBI's New York field office. At the head of the table was the FBI's special agent in charge, and on either side of him were the two humbled and deeply resentful faces of Captain O'Malley of the NYPD and Frank Shaw of the MTA. And at the other end of the table, sitting side by side, were Darnell and Maria. The power dynamic in the room had been completely and irrevocably inverted. The two, lowly and officially dismissed voices were now the most important and most powerful people in the room. They were the keepers of the ground truth. They were the only ones who knew the secret, hidden geography of the nightmare. Darnell, the quiet, humble subway worker, was now the task force's indispensable guide, their Virgil in the city's modern-day concrete inferno. He would spend hours with the FBI's tactical planners, his large, calloused finger tracing the faint, blue lines on his old, crumbling blueprints, his quiet, steady voice explaining the hidden, secret language of the tunnels. Maria, the grieving and now powerfully vindicated mother, was the task force's conscience, its moral compass. She was the one who would not let them forget that this was not just a logistical problem to be solved. This was a rescue mission. And the cargo was children. The forced alliance between the feds and the local authorities was a tense and often hostile one. O'Malley and Shaw, their own professional careers now hanging by a thread, were forced to cooperate, to hand over the files, the records, the blueprints that they had so jealously and so negligently guarded for years. But the real and most powerful alliance was the one that had been forged months ago on a windswept, elevated subway platform in the Bronx. The alliance between the subway worker and the mother. They were a team, a quiet, unassuming, and absolutely unbreakable force of nature. And they were, finally, after a long, dark, and very lonely war, on the verge of bringing the city's lost children home. The raids were a masterpiece of controlled, tactical, and subterranean warfare, guided by Darnell's unparalleled and deeply personal knowledge of the tunnel system. A series of coordinated and simultaneous strikes were launched in the dead of night. The primary target was the abandoned station where Darnell had found the holding pen. A heavily armed and specially trained FBI tactical team, led by Darnell himself, navigated the dark, treacherous, and unmapped service tunnels, their night vision goggles casting a ghostly, green glow on the ancient, decaying walls. They breached the hidden steel gate, and they flooded into the main chamber. It was empty. The makeshift prison had been hastily abandoned. The mattresses, the debris, the single, pink sneaker, it was all gone. For a heart-stopping, terrifying moment, they thought they were too late. But Darnell knew the tunnels. He knew that this chamber was not a destination, it was a doorway. He led the team to the back of the room, to a section of the rock wall that seemed solid, but was, as his old maps had suggested, another, even more cleverly, concealed door. They broke it down, and on the other side, they found it. A new and much larger tunnel, a main, underground artery of the network's invisible highway. The raids were no longer just a subterranean operation. Darnell's maps, and the new intelligence they were gathering, had shown them that the tunnel system was connected, through a series of secret, hidden exits, to a number of surface locations. Abandoned warehouses in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, a series of self-storage units in Queens, even a shutdown and supposedly empty nightclub in the meatpacking district. The city, on that night, gave up its dead and its living. In a dark, damp, and windowless sub-basement of one of the warehouses, they found them, a group of a dozen, terrified, malnourished, but very much alive children. The scenes were repeated, all across the city. In the back of a storage unit, behind a false wall of stacked empty boxes, they found 5 more. In the old, forgotten wine cellar of the nightclub, they found another group. The city's hidden, secret places, the ones that had been the network's greatest asset, were now, one by one, being breached, their monstrous secrets brought into the harsh and unforgiving light. The children were rescued from the darkness, their pale, stunned faces, a heartbreaking and ultimately triumphant testament to the stubborn, unwavering faith of the 2 lonely people who had refused to forget them. The rescue was a miracle, a story of a city that was, finally, after a long and very dark night, finding its own lost and very precious soul. The story of the ghosts of the subway and of their miraculous rescue was a story that belonged to the city. But the final, and most important, chapter belonged to a mother and a father. The aftermath of the raids was a scene of controlled and deeply emotional chaos at a local hospital, which had been turned into a temporary and very secure reunification center. The families of the dozens of children who had been rescued were brought in, one by one, their faces a mask of a hope so fragile, so profound, that it was almost painful to watch. Maria Torres was there, her hands clutched so tightly together that her knuckles were white. She sat in a small, quiet waiting room, her heart a wild, frantic drum, a rhythm of a terror and a hope so intense that they had become the same, single, and all-consuming emotion. And then, a door opened, and a social worker led a small, thin, and very scared-looking boy into the room. He was older, his face thinner, his eyes holding a deep, ancient sorrow that no 12-year-old should ever have to contain. But it was him. It was her son. It was Leo. The reunion was not a loud, cinematic explosion of joy. It was a quiet, sacred, and almost silent miracle. They simply and slowly walked towards each other, their eyes locked, and they held each other, a mother and a son, a two-person universe that had been so brutally and so violently torn apart and was now, finally and impossibly, made whole again. Darnell Jacobs was not in the waiting room. He was where he had always been most comfortable. In the background, he stood in the hallway, his own daughter, Chloe, at his side, her hand tucked tightly and protectively into his. He watched through the small glass window of the door as Maria and her son were reunited, and a look of a profound and very quiet peace settled over his own weary face. Chloe looked up at her father, at the man who the world had dismissed as a crank, as a crazy, stubborn old man. She saw not a crank, she saw a hero, her hero. "You found him, Dad," she whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "You told her you would, and you did." Darnell looked down at his daughter, at the one, single, and most important person in his world, and he thought of his wife, the woman he had lost, the woman whose memory had been the quiet guiding force behind his own stubborn and unwavering sense of duty. He had not been able to save her, but he had, in his own quiet and very persistent way, saved all of these others. He squeezed his daughter's hand, and they turned and walked away, leaving the quiet, sacred space of the reunion to the mother and the son who had finally, after a long, dark, and very lonely journey, found their way back to each other. Darnell Jacobs, the quiet, humble subway worker, the man who had listened to a whisper in the dark, walked out of the hospital and into the bright, morning light of the city, a silent, anonymous, and deeply, profoundly vindicated hero. His promise had been kept. His own, long, and very personal watch was finally over.